I recognize as a habit of people on the spectrum. They just want to do the task. They just don't want to beat around the bush with all the what they consider the unnecessary meta purposes. So the emotional exhaustion did not come from the task of mathematics, the task of physics, the task of computer engineering, but it really came from the other social demands that they had on themselves. And
Yes.
so U of M was keen on developing these skills because they knew that when these young men and young women would be in the task force, they would have to deal with the social concept, a component of it. But to be honest, emotional exhaustion often came from social exhaustion, not technical exhaustion, if I dare
Interesting.
say.
So we're under intense pressure academically and in
Yes,
the
sir.
area of engineering or discipline, but then we pile on pressure in another domain, and in this case, one that's less comfortable for that individual.
Yes.
And eventually you hit some sort of break point where the pressure actually causes, and I want you to tell me more about this. Is it a literal change in your physiology and ability to process and deal with that? Or what's happening when you reach that point of emotional exhaustion?
Well, let me tell you, not for me, but for an engineer who's comfortable with coding, for instance, I have no empirical evidence of this. Okay, I just want to make sure. But I do think that their brain is operating from the parasympathetic side of the brain, the calm, serene side of the brain. But for me, it would be the exhausting side of the brain. For them, it might be the calm. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm doing it very well. I'm doing it as if I'm just enjoying a nice meal, But let me give you an example. So think of a software company. When they do an upgrade of the software, the engineers are playing a chess tournament as the worldwide upgrade is occurring. They're just chilling. So it's all parasympathetic. The leadership, they're freaking out. So for them, it's fight and flight. It's like, is it going to work? Blah, blah, blah. The engineers have all the certainties that it's going to work for them. They have no doubt. That's sort of incredible confidence. But if the engineers were put in a leadership situation, for instance, talking to board members, their brain would switch to the opposite. They would be in fight and flight as opposed to calmness and then composure. I was always interested in working with people on the spectrum, high functioning people on the spectrum, like super brains, as awkward as can be, but extremely intelligent. Because to be honest, I'm one of them. Even though I'm not an engineer, I applied mine into a different line of work. The more I was working with preteens, teens, and adults in that situation and their parents, the more I recognized myself as a being. I didn't realize in the get-go as a therapist, I was working towards healing my own issues of meltdowns as a kid, panic attack as an adult, not knowing how to cope with the stimuli of life like an autistic person could not cope. I mean, I have a brain and I'm autistic, and this is what I discovered later after 5 or 6 years in my profession, is I was actually serving people who were exactly as I am. A lot of them are engineers. Yeah. And it's just fascinating because when I work with adults, most of them are engineers, most of them are technicians of some sort that are superbly intelligent, but socially, we're kind of like on the opposite. We've really struggled because social norms and social protocols make no sense sometimes. They are too redundant in a way,
Michel, when did you actually become aware that you personally were on the spectrum?
It was gradually, but eventually, 5 years ago, I asked a friend of mine who was one of the top specialists in Atlanta to test me. I'm going to be honest with you, it was like an emotional discovery where like, oh my God, I know I've been so crazy for so many years. It makes sense. I mean, it made me super happy. Also, it allowed me to work on a few things like theory of mind. It's very poor. Joint communication is very poor. Why was I someone who was ineffective in my relationship with my spouse? It was very helpful. That's why eventually I ended up, like we've talked, you and I, in San Diego, talking with a lot of very intelligent individuals who are essentially wired like a spectrum person, whether they are diagnosed or not. It didn't matter.